welcome back to the Cine Flux. I am your host and I am genuinely glad you are here. If you have spent any time in this space before, you already know that what we do here is not simply review films. We sit with them, we let them breathe. We ask not only what happened on screen, but what it meant, what it cost, what quiet truth it was trying to press into your hands before the credits rolled. And today I want to talk to you about a film that carries 30 years of history in its bones. A film that arrived in 2026 carrying the weight of one of cinema's most enduring and beloved horror mythologies, and asked a question I did not expect it to ask with this much sincerity. Can a survivor ever truly stop surviving? Can the person you were forced to become ever make peace with the person you wanted to be? Before we go anywhere, I need you to do something for me. Set everything else aside. Not because this film demands reverence, it is not a perfect film, and we will be entirely honest about that, but because the story it is trying to tell, beneath the masks and the knives and the familiar voice on the telephone, is one that deserves your full attention to be felt properly. Imagine a quiet Tuesday morning in a small Indiana town. A woman behind a coffee shop counter. Pale autumn light coming through a window she chose herself. In a town she chose herself. In a life she built, with the specific deliberateness of someone who knows exactly what it cost to build it. She looks ordinary. She looks almost peaceful, and if you know who she is, if you have known her since 1996, that ordinary morning is the most heartbreaking and hopeful image you have seen in a very long time. That is where Scream 7 begins in its truest sense, not in Woodsboro, not in the flames, but in the quiet, in the Tuesday, in the unbearable, beautiful fragility of a life that almost wasn't. Let us step into the dark together. There is a particular kind of dread that has no name. It is not the dread of the unknown, not the dread of the unknown, not the dread of darkness or of silence. It is something more intimate than that, something that wraps itself around your history, around the people you have loved and the choices you have survived, and it whispers to you not that something terrible is coming, but that something terrible has never truly left. That is the feeling that has always lived at the heart of the Scream franchise, not fear. Familiarity, the terrifying closeness of a monster that knows your name, knows your door, knows the exact moment you dare to believe it was finally over. And now, 30 years after a teenage girl in Woodsboro answered a phone call that changed the course of horror cinema, that same monster has returned. Older now, quieter, more patient. And in Scream 7, it comes for not just a woman, but for the daughter she tried to protect from ever knowing its voice. Before we go anywhere else, let me ask you something. What does it cost a person to survive? Not just once, not just the first terrifying night, but 7 times across 3 decades of blood and masks and unmasking, across every city and every supposed fresh start. What does that kind of survival carve out of a human soul? That is the question that sits beneath every frame of Scream 7. The film does not always answer it with elegance, but it asks it. And in this franchise, after everything it has been through, the fact that it is still asking anything at all is something worth sitting with. Scream 7 is a 2026 American slasher film, released on February 27th of this year by Paramount Pictures. It is the 7th installment in the Scream franchise, a series that began in 1996 under the direction of Wes Craven with a screenplay by Kevin Williamson. That name, Kevin Williamson, is central to understanding everything about this film and why it exists in the form it does. Williamson did not just write the first Scream. He built the bones of a mythology. He created the rules, the meta-commentary, the way that Ghostface was never just a killer but always a cinematic argument dressed in a Halloween costume. He wrote Scream 2 in 1997 and Scream 4 in 2011. He has spent decades living inside this universe, and now for the first time he steps behind the camera to direct it. That choice, that handing off the wheel from screenwriter to director, is one of the most fascinating creative decisions in the franchise's history, and it shapes the texture of every scene in ways both wonderful and frustrating, which we will explore fully. The film was written by Williamson alongside Guy Busick, From a story developed by James Vanderbilt and Busiek, the cast is a constellation of returning faces and compelling newcomers. Neve Campbell returns as Sidney Prescott, the franchise's original final girl, after her absence from Screen 6 due to a pay dispute with the studio. That return is not just a casting note, it is an emotional event. Courtney Cox is back as Gail Weathers. David Arquette appears in a form we will discuss when we reach the spoiler section. Matthew Lillard returns in a capacity that the marketing leaned heavily into, and which the film then interrogates in ways that are conceptually rich, even if the execution leaves something to be desired. New to the franchise are Isabel May as Tatum Evans, Sydney's teenage daughter, Joel McHale as Sydney's husband, Mark Evans, and Anna Camp as Jessica, a neighbor whose role in the story becomes the film's central revelation. The film runs 1 hour and 56 minutes, is rated R, and was shot on a budget of $45 million. It was filmed primarily in Atlanta, Georgia, with production running from January to March of 2025. The genre is slasher horror. But as it always has been with this franchise, it is more than that. It is a meta slasher, a franchise commentary, an attempt at elegance wrapped in carnage, and a homecoming story for a character who has earned the right to come home. What kind of story is this at its heart? Here is what I keep returning to when I think about Scream 7. At its most fundamental level, this is a film about legacy and inheritance, not the inheritance of wealth or title, but the inheritance of trauma. Sidney Prescott has spent 30 years trying to live around the edges of her own story, to build something quiet and ordinary and safe in the aftermath of extraordinary violence, and now that violence reaches for her daughter, Tatum, named after Sidney's best friend who died in the original Scream, which is a detail that carries emotional weight, the film wisely acknowledges. The story is not simply about who is wearing the ghost face mask this time. It is about whether a mother's survival instinct, sharpened by 30 years of nightmare, can protect the next generation from the darkness that has circled the family since before their daughter was born. That is the story Williamson was trying to tell. Whether he fully succeeds is a conversation we need to have in depth, but the impulse behind it, the emotional architecture of it, is genuine and worthwhile. The director's vision here is filtered through something intensely personal. Kevin Williamson has said publicly that he was thinking of Wes Craven throughout the making of this film. Craven, who directed the first 4 Scream films and who passed away in 2015, created a franchise built on intelligence and self-awareness, on the idea that characters who understand horror tropes are still not safe from them, because understanding a rule does not mean you can survive its application. Williamson carries that DNA into his directorial debut with visible reverence. There are moments in this film that feel genuinely indebted to Craven's ability to make space feel dangerous, to make a simple hallway or a backyard feel like a place where death is listening. Those moments are real and they are worth celebrating, but Williamson is stepping into the director's chair for the first time on a franchise feature with enormous expectations, and the unevenness that results from that inexperience is also real and also honest to acknowledge. Should you watch this film? Let me answer that carefully, because the answer is not simple. If you love the Scream franchise, if Sidney Prescott matters to you, if you have grown up watching this woman survive the unsurvivable and come out the other side with something that looks like strength, even when it is held together with sheer will alone, then yes, you should watch it. Neve Campbell's return alone justifies the experience. If you are a casual viewer looking for a great horror film to discover, this is not where I would start your journey. The franchise is in a complicated place right now, and this film wears that complication openly. But for those of you who feel something when that ghost face mask appears on screen, who remember exactly where you were the first time you heard Roger L. Jackson's voice on a telephone, this film offers you something. It is imperfect. It is sometimes frustrating, but it is alive with a kind of emotional urgency that makes it worth your time. When I first sat with this film, I expected a corrective. I expected a film that understood the mess of what had happened to this franchise in recent years, the chaos of the Barrera dismissal, the Ortega departure, The revolving door of directors, the creative turbulence that followed this project like a storm cloud, and I expected Williamson to use all of that as fuel to make something that felt settled, grounded, classically constructed in the way that only someone who has been living inside this mythology for 30 years could manage. In part, that expectation was met. The opening scene gave me something I had not felt from this franchise in a while. There is a sequence set in Woodsboro at the Marker house, the house where the original kills in the first Scream took place. Two young fans of the in-universe Stab films visit the location, drawn by the decades-old rumors that Stumacher may have survived having a television dropped on his head. It is night. The house is exactly as you remember it, and when Ghostface appears there is a weight to it, a sense of the history embedded in the walls that creates genuine dread rather than mere spectacle. Williamson is establishing right from the first frames that this film understands where it comes from. The house burns by the time the scene ends, and you understand that as a symbol immediately. This franchise is setting fire to its own past, or trying to. The atmosphere the film creates from minute one is one of its greatest achievements, and I say that having significant reservations about the film overall. The world of Pine Grove, Indiana, where Sydney has relocated and built her quiet new life, has a texture to it that feels carefully observed. This is not a city of loud menace the way New York was in Scream 6. It is a small town, gentle on the surface, full of the kind of normalcy that always feels precarious in a screen film, because we know it is temporal. Sydney runs a coffee shop. She has a daughter who is about to discover boys and friendship and all the ordinary terror of teenage life before the extraordinary terror arrives. She is married to a man who is decent and kind. And in the early scenes, there is something genuinely moving about watching Neve Campbell inhabit that domesticity, because you understand what it cost Sydney to build it, the years of trauma and survival and reinvention that preceded this apparently peaceful morning. When I sat with those early scenes, I felt something the Scream franchise had not made me feel in some time. I felt care, genuine care for a character, and that is entirely to Neve Campbell's credit and to Williamson's understanding of who this woman is. But here is the thing about this film, and it is the tension that runs through every frame of it. There is a difference between understanding a character emotionally and serving that character narratively. Scream 7 loves Sidney Prescott with the depth and sincerity of someone who has known her for 30 years, but it does not always know how to build a story worthy of that love. The middle sections of this film have pacing problems, real ones. The mystery of Ghostface's identity loses tension earlier than it should. The new characters, with one notable exception, feel underwritten in ways that prevent you from caring when they are in danger. And the ultimate reveal, while conceptually interesting, is executed with a sloppiness that undermines the intellectual pleasure the franchise has always provided. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let me walk you through the experience of this film the way I lived it, scene by scene, as an emotional journey rather than a checklist. The story proper begins with Sydney in Pine Grove. She receives a call at her coffee shop, and the voice on the other end is the voice she has heard in her nightmares for 30 years. The ghost face voice, delivered with unsettling precision by Roger L. Jackson, whose voice work in this franchise is genuinely one of its most underappreciated artistic elements. Jackson has an ability to make that voice feel simultaneously and intimate, like a threat whispered by someone who knows you too well. But this call escalates into something new. Ghostface requests a video call, and when Sydney accepts, she is confronted with an aged and scarred face that has haunted fan theory for decades, Stu Macher. Matthew Lillard's Stu, or Da, marked, speaking to her through a screen as though 30 years of apparent death were nothing but a pause. This moment is the film's central creative Campbell. For 3 decades, Scream fans have debated whether Stu survived the television to the head at the end of the original film. The evidence suggesting his death was always circumstantial. The possibility of his survival was always seductive. And here, Scream 7 seems to be saying, what if the fans were right? What if Stu lived? The film spends its first and second acts feeding that possibility with genuine craft. There are details that accumulate, Gail Weathers arrives in town, drawn by the new Ghostface murders, and reveals that the documentation confirming Stu's death in Woodsboro appears to have been incomplete, that certain coroner records seem to be missing or were never filed properly. Sidney begins investigating whether what she's seeing is real or a technological construction. This is where the film introduces its most interesting thematic thread, the question of artificial intelligence and deepfake technology, and what it means that in 2026, a killer can wear not just a mask but an entirely fabricated face, can weaponize the dead and the lost against those who survive them. This is genuinely resonant territory. In a franchise built on the idea that horror tropes can be understood and analyzed and still cannot save you, the arrival of deepfake technology as a weapon feels like a natural evolution of the Scream mythology. The idea that a monster can now appear to be anyone, can assume the face of your worst memories, your oldest fears, your most personal ghost, is thematically rich in exactly the way that the best Scream films have always been. And here is where the film shifts completely. The arrival of the first Ghostface revelation changes everything you think you know about what kind of story this is, and from that point, the film accelerates toward an ending that is both structurally clever and emotionally disappointing in ways we need to unpack with full attention. But that, as I said, requires the spoiler section. For now, let us spend time with what this film achieves on the level of craft, character, and construction. Let us begin with performance because in Scream 7, performance is where the film lives and breathes most honestly. Neve Campbell is the reason this film works at all. I want to say that clearly and without qualification because it is entirely true and it needs to be felt rather than just stated. Campbell has inhabited Sidney Prescott across 7 films and 30 years of screen time, and what she brings to this performance is something that goes beyond craft or instinct. It is accumulated truth. There is a weight to the way she carries herself in this film, a physical and emotional heaviness that is not the weight of fatigue but of history. When she walks through a scene, even a quiet domestic one, you see the years in her posture, the alertness in her eyes that never fully turns off, the faint tremor of someone who has learned to remain vigilant in even the most ordinary moments, because ordinary moments have betrayed her before. This is acting as autobiography in the most artistic sense of that word, the scene that proves it completely, the single moment that demonstrates what Campbell is doing at a level beyond what the screenplay hands her, is the sequence where she first receives the video call from the person claiming to be Stomacher. Watch her face in that moment. There is not a single emotion present, but a layered constellation of them. There is recognition, there is disbelief, there is the muscle memory of terror that never quite healed. There is the deliberate effort to remain analytical, to not allow fear to overtake reason, to function as a woman who has survived enough to know that panic is a luxury she cannot afford. And beneath all of it, barely visible but entirely present, if you are paying attention, there is grief. The grief of someone who had allowed herself to believe finally and fully that the worst was behind her. That one expression, held across perhaps 15 seconds of screen time, contains the entire emotional history of this franchise. It is magnificent. And it is the performance of Campbell's career in this role, which is saying something considerable. Isabel May as Tatum Evans, Sydney's daughter, is the film's other significant performance achievement, though the screenplay does not always serve her as well as Campbell is served. May brings a quality to Tatum that feels genuinely lived in rather than constructed for audience sympathy. She is not written as a genre-aware character in the way that the Meads twins, Mindy and Chad, are genre-aware. Tatum is the next generation final girl who has not yet been shaped by self-consciousness about the rules and may plays that openness with real warmth. There is a scene early in the film where Tatum is with her friends at school and may find something specific in the way Tatum moves through her social world that suggests a girl who has been carefully shielded from her mother's past and who has developed her own quieter anxieties as a result of that shielding. She does not know what she does not know. And when the nightmare arrives, Mehandes Tatum's transition from ordinary teenager to survivor in the making with an intelligence that the material does not always deserve. The generational echo between Campbell and May is the emotional spine of this film, and when the two are on screen together, particularly in the climax, there is something genuinely moving happening in the space between them. Courtney Cox as Gail Weathers continues to be one of the franchise's most underappreciated pleasures. Gail has always been a more complicated character than Sidney, more morally ambiguous, more professionally calculating, and the franchise has spent 7 films slowly softening her without ever fully surrendering her edge. Cox plays that complication beautifully. There is a moment where Gail arrives in Pine Grove with her new crew and the film stages her first reunion with Sidney, and Cox does something wonderful. She lets Gail's professional armor drop just slightly, just enough to show the friendship underneath, but not so much that we forget who Gail Weathers fundamentally is. The scene where Gail runs over the first Ghostface with her car is played with a kind of casual, almost annoyed efficiency that Cox has perfected over 7 films, and it gets a laugh that is entirely earned. The writing, however, does not give Cox enough to do in the film's second and third acts, and that is one of the screenplay's genuine failures. Matthew Lillard's presence in this film deserves its own paragraph because it represents one of the franchise's most creatively interesting choices and also one of its most frustrating missed opportunities. Lillard is not physically present in the way the marketing materials implied. The Stumacher who appears in this film is, for most of its running time, an AI deepfake constructed by one of the film's antagonists. Lillard recorded video specifically for the film, aged and scarred, giving a performance that is filtered through the language of digital manipulation. This is a conceptually fascinating decision. The franchise is using its own mythology against itself, weaponizing nostalgia as a tool of psychological warfare. The idea that an obsessed killer can resurrect the ghost of a dead monster and use it to torment the original survivor is genuinely smart in a scream way, but the execution means that Lillard, one of the franchise's most electric presences, is essentially absent from his own return. The character of Stumacher as a living, breathing presence never actually arrives, and that leaves a hollow space in the film that its meta-commentary never fully fills. Now let us talk about writing, because the screenplay of Scream 7 is a document of sharp intellect and significant frustration existing in very close proximity to each other, sometimes within the same scene. Williamson and Busick are working with a difficult grief. They are writing a sequel that must honor the legacy of the franchise's original characters while integrating new ones who can carry the story forward. They are operating in the aftermath of significant casting losses. The departure of Melissa Barrera and Jenna Ortega, whose characters Sam and Tara Carpenter had been building towards something that this film now has to exist without. And they are trying to introduce thematic concerns, specifically around AI and deepfake technology, that feel genuinely contemporary without feeling grafted on. That is an enormous amount to manage, and there are passages of the screenplay that manage it beautifully. The scene where Sidney and Gail sit together and talk about what it means to keep surviving, to keep outlasting the monsters, is the best writing in the film. It is a scene that is not about plot mechanics or investigation or the unraveling of a mystery. It is simply two women who have circled each other for 30 years, who have been rivals and friends, and estranged and reunited more times than they can count, sitting in the quiet of a small town and saying things to each other that they have never quite been able to say before. It is a scene that earns every word through the accumulated history of the franchise, and it represents Williamson at his most confident as a writer, finding the emotional truth beneath the genre machinery and letting it breathe without apology. This is what this film does dance about Sydney and Gail in a way that the radio silence films never quite captured. These are not just genre archetypes. They are women with a relationship that is complex enough to sustain an entire film on its own. And when the screenplay trusts that relationship, the film becomes genuinely moving. The writing also succeeds in the way it structures the mystery. The three Ghostface configuration is a classic Scream mechanism, and Williamson handles it with the understanding that the joy of a Scream film is not in the revelation of the killer's identity, but in the experience of inhabiting uncertainty alongside the characters. The early misdirection involving Stu's apparent return is well constructed in terms of its clue placement and its emotional resonance, even if the ultimate payoff is weaker than the setup. The dialogue for Sidney in particular is written with the kind of intimacy that comes from 3 decades of living with a character. There are lines that feel specific to who Sidney is at this exact moment in her life, the specific texture of a survivor who has rebuilt herself multiple times and who understands with a kind of rueful clarity that the rebuilding is never quite finished. Where the writing falls short, and this matters, is in its treatment of the new characters. Tatum's friend group is underwritten with a genericness that feels like a creative failure in a franchise that has always prided itself on giving its victims at least one quality that makes you care about them before they die. The friends are pleasant and competent, but they are types rather than people. When they die, and several of them do, the deaths produce shock through staging rather than grief through attachment. McKenna Grace and Celeste O'Connor, two performers with genuine screen presence and real talent, are wasted on characters that seem to exist primarily to populate the body count. This is a problem that runs deeper than individual character writing. It speaks to a screenplay that spent so much energy reconstructing the film's legacy architecture that it forgot to build the rooms that new inhabitants would actually live in. Let us talk about the visual language of Scream 7, because this is where Kevin Williamson's directorial inexperience is most visible and also where his reverence for the franchise's visual history is most affecting. Williamson is not a visual stylist in the way that Wes Craven was. Craven had an almost architectural understanding of space, a gift for making rooms feel wrong, for using geometry to create dread before anything had happened in the frame. The radio silence films brought a kinetic contemporary energy to the franchise, a handheld intimacy that suited their New York setting. Williamson's visual approach is more straightforward than either of those predecessors, and in the film's middle sections, it sometimes tips into a flatness that the review aggregate was being honest about when it described certain sequences as resembling higher-end television rather than feature cinema. But there are shots in this film that will stay with me. The first is an early sequence where Sidney stands in the doorway of her coffee shop at closing time, looking out at the small town street, and the camera holds on her face as the last of the daylight fades behind her. There is nothing overtly threatening in the frame, but the way the shot is composed, Sidney in the doorway between the warm light of her interior world and the darkening exterior, creates a visual metaphor for her entire existence in this film with a quiet precision that is entirely right. She lives in a doorway. She always has. The safe world she has built is real, but so is the darkness waiting outside it. That is the image. The second shot worth holding onto is near the film's climax, when Sidney finds her daughter tied to a chair in the backyard, deliberately echoing the opening of the original Scream. Williamson frames this shot from Sidney's perspective, and the horror of it is not the visual spectacle of the ghost face costume or the cruelty of the staging, but the recognition that crosses Sidney's face. She has been here before, not metaphorically, literally. Her entire life has led her back to this specific image, and Neve Campbell plays the recognition with a stillness that is more frightening than any jump scare the film attempts. That stillness is the visual achievement of Scream 7, and it comes from Williamson understanding, at a deep and genuine level, what this moment means for this character and for this franchise. The score by Marco Beltrami is an achievement that deserves more attention than it will receive in the general discourse around this film. Beltrami scored the original 4 Scream films, and his return here is not merely a nostalgic gesture, but a creative conversation between his original compositions and the emotional weight of everything that has happened to this franchise in the intervening years. He introduces new compositions, including a piece called Mrs. Evans' Lament, which is an orchestral reinvention of the classic Sidney's Lament from the original film. filtered through the lens of a woman who has changed her name, changed her location, changed her life, but cannot change the melody that follows her. That musical choice, the idea that Sidney's grief is still recognizable even through all the transformations she has undergone, is one of the most emotionally intelligent decisions in the entire film. The score also features school drama, a piece written for the film's most effective suspense sequence, set in a school theater where Beltrami uses silence as a structural element, letting the absence of score create a kind of acoustic dread that makes every footstep audible, every shadow significant. Silence is used throughout this film with real intentionality. There are several scenes where music stops entirely, not through fade, but through an abrupt cut to nothing, and in those moments of sudden acoustic emptiness, the film achieves something that its more conventional horror mechanics cannot match. It is a technique that Craven understood deeply, the way silence is not the absence of sound, but a form of presence, a kind of negative space in which danger becomes more imaginable because your own imagination is allowed to fill it. Williamson, whatever his limitations as a visual director, understands this lesson from his mentor and applies it with care. On the level of craft and construction, Scream 7 functions best when all its technical layers are working in the same direction. The production design of Pine Grove, with its small-town normalcy, interrupted by the institutional grey of the Fallbrook Psychiatric Facility, creates a visual geography that maps onto the film's thematic concerns. The ordinary and the disturbed exist in close proximity. The editing in the film's set pieces is efficient, serving clarity over style, which is both its strength and its limitation. You always understand the spatial relationships in the action sequences, which is not something to take for granted in contemporary horror. But there is a lack of formal ambition in the cutting that prevents the film from achieving the kind of rhythmic intensity that its best predecessors maintained throughout the second and third acts. Now, honesty requires us to spend time with where this film falls short, because the weaknesses here are not cosmetic, they are structural. They affect the overall experience in ways that a genuine assessment of this film must acknowledge with clarity and fairness. The most significant flaw in Screen 7 is its killer reveal, and specifically the characters behind the masks. The Scream franchise has always lived and died by the quality of its villain motivation. The best Ghostface revelations, Billy Loomis's grief-twisted obsession in the original Mrs. Denson, Loomis's maternal vengeance in Scream 2, Charlie Walker and Jill Roberts' genuinely chilling commentary on celebrity culture and self-made victimhood in Scream 4, these were revelations that made you rethink the entire film you had just watched. They had an intellectual elegance, a sense that the motive was not just a narrative function but a thematic statement about the culture the franchise was addressing. The killers in Scream 7, Marco and Jessica, do not achieve this. Marco is the weakest element in the film, a character who appears briefly before the reveal, who has no meaningful relationship with Sidney or with the franchise's mythology, and whose motivation amounts to being an accomplice rather than a genuine architect of horror. He is technically competent but emotionally hollow, which is the worst thing you can say about a Scream villain. Jessica is more interesting conceptually. An obsessed fan of Sidney's self-help book who kills her abusive husband as a result of Sidney's writing and then grows resentful when Sidney retreats from public life rather than continuing to perform the role of the heroic survivor that Jessica required of her. That motivation is thematically rich, genuinely connected to the film's concerns about how survivors are consumed by the public appetite for their stories. But the execution of the reveal rushes the explanation, gives Anacamp insufficient time to fully inhabit the madness beneath the mundane, and results in a climax that produces intellectual interest rather than genuine shock. The pacing problem in the film's second act is real and persistent. There is a stretch of approximately 30 minutes in the middle of the film where the investigation into Stu's possible return circles without momentum, when new characters are introduced and killed without sufficient weight, and where the film seems uncertain about which star it wants to occupy. Is this a nostalgic return to the classical screen template? Is it a contemporary commentary on AI and digital identity? Is it an emotional examination of trauma and generational inheritance? all of those are valid stories for Scream 7 to tell, but the film cannot quite commit to any of them fully enough in its middle section to sustain your engagement through the periods between its set pieces. There is also a tonal inconsistency that Scream has always navigated carefully, but which this film manages with less precision than its predecessors. The franchise has always balanced horror and humor in a specific ratio, the dark comedy of genre self-awareness coexisting with genuine dread. When that balance tips too far toward humor, the deaths lose consequence. There are moments in Scream 7, particularly involving the comedy beats around Mindy and Chad as Gale's news crew interns, where the tonal shift is too abrupt and too long, pulling you out of the film's emotional logic just when it should be tightening its grip. These are real flaws, not minor texture. They matter to the experience of sitting with this film, but they exist alongside genuine achievements, and a fair assessment of Scream 7 requires holding both truths simultaneously, which is what we are going to continue doing as we move into the making of this film and the context that surrounds it. Let us now talk about how this film came to exist in the form it does, because the production history of Scream 7 is genuinely extraordinary, a story of creative turbulence and institutional upheaval that rivals anything in the film itself for drama. And understanding what this film went through to reach the screen reshapes how you see almost every choice it makes. The film was officially announced in August 2020 on what would have been Wes Craven's birthday, a detail that feels intentional as a statement of intent. The original plan was for Radio Silence, the directing duo of Matt Bettinelli, Orpin and Tyler Gillette, to continue the franchise they had revitalized with the 2022 Scream reboot and Scream Z. The new leading duo of Melissa Barrera and Jenna Ortega, who had brought enormous energy and emotional specificity to Sam and Tara Carpenter, were expected to return. Christopher Landon was later hired after Radio Silence exited due to scheduling conflicts with their film Abigail. Then, in November 2023, Melissa Barrera was fired from the franchise by Spyglass Media Group following statements she made on social media about the war in Gaza. Spyglass characterized her posts as anti-Semitic. Barrera and her supporters characterized the firing as a disproportionate response to humanitarian advocacy. The controversy was significant and divisive, and it had immediate practical consequences for the film, because as director Christopher Landon himself said at the time, the entire script had been built around her character. Without Barrera, there was effectively no movie in its existing form. Landon then also exited the project, citing publicly that he had received death threats from fans and that the professional environment had become untenable. His description of the experience as a dream job that became a nightmare carries the kind of quiet devastation that makes it impossible to dismiss as mere professional complaint. Jenna Ortega followed with her own departure, later clarifying in a 2035 interview that the scheduling conflict explanation was not the full story, that the changes in the creative team and the loss of her colleagues made the project no longer feel like the one she had signed up for. What emerged from this chaos was a creative decision that is, in retrospect, either brilliant or the only available option. Bring Kevin Williamson back, rebuild around the legacy characters, specifically Sidney Prescott, and use Neve Campbell's return not as a nostalgic cameo but as the film's emotional and narrative center. Campbell, who had been absent from Scream 6 due to the studio's failure to offer her adequate compensation, agreed to return once the terms were made right. The fact that her first act upon her return was to also take on a producer credit is significant. Campbell was not simply returning to play Sidney. She was returning to help shape the stories Sidney would inhabit, and that creative partnership with Williamson, who had written all of Sidney's best moments across the first four films, gave the project a foundation that the chaos of its development had temporarily destroyed. Filming began on January 7, 2025 in Atlanta, Georgia, and concluded on March 12, 2025, a relatively compressed production schedule for a franchise film of this scale. Kevin Williamson made a post on Instagram during filming that has become something of a touchstone for understanding the emotional energy on set. He wrote about having one of the best days of his life, about the extraordinary cast and crew who had his back, about thinking of Wes Craven throughout the process, about the profound impact that Craven had on his life and career. It is the post of someone who is genuinely moved to be where they are, and that emotional sincerity translates into certain moments of the finished film with a directness that is one of its most affecting qualities. One of the most fascinating production details is the casting of Isabel May as Tatum. May had come off a significant role in 1883, the Yellowstone prequel series, and her ability to portray a young woman navigating enormous emotional weight in a narrative that connects her to something much larger than herself made her a natural fit for the daughter of Sidney Prescott. The name Tatum for Sydney's daughter, named after her best friend Tatum Riley who died in the original Scream, was a detail proposed early in the development process, and it represents the kind of character-level thinking that reveals how deeply Williamson was drawing on his knowledge of the franchise's emotional history. The name is not just a narrative detail, it is a statement about how Sydney carries her dead with her, how she honors them even in the ordinary acts of naming a child, and how the past in this franchise is never merely history, but always present weight. Another fascinating production fact concerns Marco Beltrami's score. Beltrami revealed on his Instagram in August 2025, while the film was in post-production, that he had completed the score with an orchestra in Budapest. He released audio snippets that included a piece called What's in a Name, which turned out to be thematically connected to the film's central AI and deepfake concerns, exploring musically what it means for an identity to be a construction rather than a lived truth. This piece plays during the film's most conceptually interesting sequence, where the deepfake technology is revealed in full, and the music adds a layer of genuine melancholy to what could have been a purely technical plot revelation. Knowing that Beltrami was thinking about identity and authenticity in musical terms while scoring this scene gives that sequence an additional resonance when you know to listen for it. The film was shot in Atlanta rather than on location in any real-world analog for Pine Grove, Indiana. The production design team built the town of Pine Grove on Atlanta area sound stages and at local locations, creating a small town visual language through selective construction and careful location scouting. The Prescott Evans family home, where much of the film's climax takes place, was partially constructed and left deliberately unfinished for the film's final sequence, an unfinished carriage that becomes a significant setting for the confrontation between Sidney and the final Ghostface. Williamson apparently requested that the unfinished quality of the space be maintained and even emphasized, because he wanted the final confrontation to take place in a space that felt genuinely incomplete, still under construction, a reflection of where Sidney and Tatum both are at the moment the film ends. Whether you find that symbolic resonance effective, or whether the amount of screen time devoted to the unfinished carriage feels disproportionate to its dramatic value is, from what I have seen in critical responses, genuinely divided. The film also features 5 original songs on its soundtrack, a franchise record for original music. Twisting the Knife by Ice Nine Kills, featuring Mecca Grace, is the most prominent and received significant promotional push. The song is essentially a horror pop hybrid that wears its Scream franchise heritage openly, and the music video, which features Grace in a Ghostface adjacent visual language, became a significant piece of the marketing campaign. The Jesse Murph song Criminal and Don Toliver's Creepin' were used during the film's more contemporary feeling scenes involving the teenage characters, and their presence represents an attempt to give the film a musical modernity that would connect it to its youngest character's world. Let us now step back from the film itself and look at how it landed in the world, because the cultural and commercial reception of Scream 7 tells a story that is almost as complicated and interesting as the film's own internal narrative. The box office performance of Scream 7 was extraordinary. The film made $7.8 million from Thursday night previews alone, a franchise record. By opening weekend, it had grossed $63.6 million in North America, surpassing Scream 6 as the largest domestic opening in the franchise's history. By the first week of April 26, the worldwide total had reached $205 million against a production budget of $45 million, making it the highest grossing film in the entire Scream franchise. That commercial performance is significant for several reasons. It tells you that the audience for this franchise is enormous and enormously loyal. It tells you that Neve Campbell's return was a cultural event that people were willing to show up in theaters for in significant numbers. And it tells you, with some clarity, that commercial success and critical quality are sometimes traveling in opposite directions at the same time, because the critical reception of Scream 7 was significantly more mixed than its box office would suggest. The film received generally negative reviews from professional critics, sitting in the low to mid-50s on Rotten Tomatoes at the time of its release, with a consensus that acknowledged the emotional significance of Campbell's return while expressing real frustration with the quality of the screenplay's construction, particularly the killer reveal, the underwritten new characters, and the film's inability to commit fully to any of its thematic threads. The reviews that praised the film most enthusiastically did so primarily on the strength of Campbell's performance and the emotional resonance of certain specific scenes, rather than on the basis of the film as a coherent whole. The gap between critical response and audience response was notable. General audiences, as reflected in the CinemaScore and audience polls, responded more warmly than critics did. This is a gap we see frequently in franchise films, where the emotional investment that long-term fans bring to a viewing experience creates a level of goodwill that compensates for narrative weaknesses that a more neutral observer would penalize. Fans who had waited 3 years to see Neve Campbell in the screen costume again, who had watched the franchise go through its most turbulent period of development, were in many cases experiencing this film as a kind of relief as much as a piece of cinema, the relief of having Sidney back, the relief of Williamson back, the relief of Gail and Sidney on screen together. That emotional context shapes the viewing experience in ways that are real and valid, even if they are distinct from a purely aesthetic assessment. The streaming life of Scream 7 is already well underway, with the film having been released for digital rental and purchase on March 31st, 2026, including over 40 minutes of bonus content. The second wave audience for this film, the people who will discover it on streaming rather than in theaters, will encounter it in a different emotional register than those who saw it opening weekend surrounded by franchise devotees. And for that second wave audience, I think the film's genuine achievements, Campbell's performance, Beltrami's score, certain specific scenes of genuine emotional power will register more clearly without the context of franchise loyalty amplifying their effect, but also without the context of franchise disappointment making the film's weaknesses feel more personal than they might otherwise. Regarding awards, Scream 7 is not an award season film and was not positioned as one. There is no realistic path to nominations in the major categories. But it is worth noting what deserves recognition in an alternative universe where genre films receive the institutional acknowledgement their craft sometimes warrants. Neve Campbell's performance would, in a fairer world, be the subject of serious conversation in the Best Actress category. She's doing work in this film that most of the industry's dramatic prestige productions do not achieve. And the invisibility of that work in awards discourse is a reflection of the industry's persistent undervaluation of horror as a site of genuine performance artistry. Marco Beltrami's score similarly deserves more recognition than it will receive. The craft of composing a score that is simultaneously a continuation of a 30-year musical conversation and a genuinely new artistic statement is considerable, and Beltrami achieves it with elegance. Now let us place this film in the larger story of the franchise it belongs to, because Scream 7 does not exist in isolation. It arrives as part of a mythology that spans 3 decades, 7 theatrical films, a television series, and an in-universe film franchise called Stab that the films have been playfully deconstructing since 1997. Where does Scream 7 stand in that sequence? How does it deepen or repeat what came before? What does it add to the larger conversation that this franchise has been having with the horror genre, with cinema itself, and with the culture it inhabits? Here is what I keep returning to when I think about Scream 7 in the context of the full franchise. The original Scream is a film about genre awareness as a survival strategy. The idea that knowing horror movie rules gives you an advantage, or at least an understanding of what might be coming, is the intellectual game at the heart of the 1996 film. It was revolutionary at the time because it trusted its audience to be sophisticated about the genre they were watching, to appreciate the meta-commentary without it destroying the genuine dread. Scream 2 extended the game to sequels, asking what it means when the sequel to a real-life horror story is made into a film. Scream 3 and 4 grappled with trilogies and reboots and the way franchise machinery consumes and distorts the original creative impulse. The radio silence films Scream 2022 and Scream This address the contemporary horror landscape, the legacy sequel, the franchise as a cultural institution that generates new victims by drawing new generations into its orbit. Scream 7 addresses something different. It addresses nostalgia itself as a weapon. This is the film's most interesting thematic contribution to the franchise, and it is the area where Williamson's specific perspective as someone who lived through the creation of this mythology is most visible. The film asks what happens when the past is not just remembered but deployed. What happens when your history is turned into a mechanism of torture, when the faces of the dead appear on screens and threaten you in voices indistinguishable from the originals? The deepfake technology in the film is not merely a contemporary detail dropped in to make the story feel current. It is a thematic argument about the franchise itself. Every Scream sequel is, in some sense, a deepfake of the original. Every return of a character, every echo of a situation from earlier in the mythology is a constructed resurrection of something that was already complete. Scream 7 makes that subtext explicit, and in doing so, it adds a layer of self-awareness to the franchise that is genuinely new. Does it deepen what came before? In some ways, yes. The film's exploration of Sydney's post-Scream 6 life, the choices she made during the events of that film, specifically her decision not to go to New York when Ghostface was killing people connected to her circle, is woven into the villain's motivation in a way that creates continuity between the entries rather than treating each film as a disconnected episode. The fact that Jessica's obsession is partly fueled by her disappointment in Sydney's choice to retreat rather than engage is a meaningful narrative connection to the larger franchise arc. What it adds to the conversation is the question of what survivors owe to the culture that has made them symbols, and that question is genuinely interesting, genuinely contemporary, and genuinely Scream. Does it repeat what came before? In some ways, unavoidably. The structure of a Scream film is by definition repetitive, the same shape of mystery and unmasking that the franchise has been working through since 1996. But repetition in the Scream franchise is not quite the same as failure, because the franchise has always understood repetition as a form of rule following, and breaking or bending those rules is part of the game. The question is whether a Scream 7 bends the rules in ways that feel earned, and here the answer is partially yes and partially no, which puts it in the middle of the franchise's quality spectrum rather than at either of its extremes. How does it shape what comes next? Scream 8 is already in development. Lila Zuckerman and Nora Zuckerman have been announced as the screenwriters, and Neve Campbell has expressed interest in returning. The ending of Scream 7, which we will discuss fully in the spoiler section, positions both Sidney and Tatum as survivors of a specific kind, changed by the film's events in ways that suggest a story that is not finished but entering a new phase. If Scream 8 takes the generational baton fully and makes Tatum the primary protagonist of her own story, building on what Isabel May established here, there is real potential. The franchise's history of passing the torch, the way Scream 2022 attempted to do this with Sam and Tara, shows both the possibilities and the risks of that approach, but the foundation that Scream 7 lays for Tatum's character, imperfect as it is in execution, is solid enough to build from. Let us now talk about what Scream 7 is really saying. Beneath the kills and the mystery and the meta-commentary, in the territory of genuine human truth that the best horror films have always been able to access, Think about what the title of Sidney's book means. Out of Darkness. It is described in both Scream 4 and Scream 7 as a self help book, a survivor's account of how to reclaim your life from trauma. And in Scream 7, that book becomes a weapon in a deeply specific way. It inspires someone to kill, not someone who misread it, not someone who twisted its message into something it was never meant to be. Jessica Bowden killed her abusive husband, and she credits Sidney's book, Sidney's example, Sidney's philosophy of survival as her inspiration. She then becomes obsessed with Sidney as a figure, as a symbol, as a final girl, and when Sidney retreats from the public role that Jessica needed her to continue playing, Jessica feels betrayed. She feels that Sidney abandoned her story. Think about what that means for a moment. The film is asking whether survivors have responsibilities to the people who found hope in their survival, whether putting your story into the world, writing a book, sharing your experience, creates a kind of obligation to continue being what that story made you in the eyes of its readers. And Sydney's answer, her choice to disappear into Pine Grove to change her name to become Sydney Evans rather than Sidney Prescott, is that she does not owe anyone her continued exposure to danger. She has already given everything. She deserves to live. That is the emotional and intellectual core of Scream 7. The tension between what the world wants from survivors and what survivors owe to themselves. The impossibility of complete retreat for someone whose story has become public property. The way that help books, memoirs, public narratives of survival can simultaneously empower and endanger the people who write them, because those stories attract not just readers who heal, but readers who are drawn to the darkness at the center of the narrative. Sydney's book helped Jessica survive an abusive marriage, which is genuinely good, and then it made Jessica obsessed with a version of Sydney that was mythologized rather than human, which is genuinely terrifying. Both of those things are true, and the fact that the film allows them to be simultaneously true without resolving the tension through simple moral judgment is one of its most mature and thoughtful gestures. The recurring motif of the deepfake of faces that are and are not is also worth unpacking as a symbol rather than merely a plot device. The Scream franchise has always been interested in masks. The Ghostface mask is specifically about the anonymity of malice, the idea that evil is not identifiable by its face, that the person behind the knife is someone you might know, someone you might love, someone who looks ordinary until they choose not to be. The deepfake extends this metaphor into the digital age. In a world where faces can be constructed and manipulated with technological ease, where the dead can be given new words to speak and new actions to perform, the question of authenticity becomes genuinely destabilizing. When Sydney looks at Stu on the screen, she is looking at a face that carries 30 years of emotional weight, a face connected to the worst night of her life, and she cannot immediately determine whether it is real or fabricated. That uncertainty is not just a plot mechanism, it is a statement about living in an age of infinite manipulation, about the exhaustion of trying to determine what is real in an information environment saturated with convincing fabrications. Scream 7 arrived in a cultural moment that was particularly sensitized to the politics surrounding it. The controversy over Melissa Barrera's firing followed this film through its entire development and marketing campaign, and it arrived in theaters with a protest at its premiere organized by pro-Palestinian groups. This context is inseparable from the cultural experience of the film, even if the film itself does not directly address it. There is an irony in a film that features deepfake technology as its central horror conceit being released amid genuine public discourse about deepfakes and AI-generated content, about authenticity and representation and whose voice is allowed to speak. The film did not plan to arrive in exactly this conversation, but it arrived in it nonetheless. The discourse around Barrera's firing also raised questions about corporate power and franchise loyalty, about what it means when a studio can remove a lead actor from a major franchise over speech ads outside of their professional work, and whether the audience for that franchise has any responsibility or power in such decisions. The fact that Scream 7 became the highest grossing film in the franchise's history despite significant protests and controversies tells you something about the complexity of cultural consumption, about the way people make peace with difficult contexts in order to access something they love. The protest at the premiere was small, measured in dozens rather than hundreds, but the conversation it represented was larger and more sustained. The influence of this film on the franchise's future is already taking shape with Scream 8 in development. More broadly, the film's use of AI and deepfake technology as horror mechanisms may prove to have a genuine influence on the slasher genre, which is always looking for new ways to update its toolkit of fear. The idea of using digital resurrection, turning the loved and the dead into instruments of terror, is one that feels genuinely contemporary and genuinely scary in ways that extend beyond this specific film. If other horror films pick up that thread and develop it with more narrative care than Scream 7 fully achieved, the legacy of this film may be in the concept it introduced rather than in the execution it delivered. Does this film feel timeless or perfectly of its moment? Both in different registers. The core of the story, a mother protecting her daughter from the violence that followed her own survival, is as timeless as any story in the horror genre. It connects to something fundamental about parental love and its specific terror, the inability to transfer your own scars to your children in a way that would protect them. That is a feeling that transcends any specific cultural moment. But deepfake element, the AI element, the cultural conversation about authenticity and digital manipulation is very specifically of this moment, which means that the film's resonance will shift over time as that technology becomes either more normalized or more distant. From this moment, we go into full spoilers. If you have not yet seen this film, stop here, go experience it first, and come back. Some things deserve to be felt before they are understood. With that said, let us go all the way into the story that Scream 7 tells, every twist and every turn, every death and every revelation, and examine what the film is doing, not just narratively but emotionally and thematically in each of its major movements. The film opens in Woodsboro. Two new artists, Stud and his girlfriend Madison, are visiting the Marker house. This is the house where Stu Marker lived, where their party took place at the end of the original Scream, where Billy Loomis was unmasked and killed, where Sidney Prescott first survived the unsurvivable. Scott is a fan of the in-universe stab movies, and he talks breathlessly about the rumors that Stu Marker might have survived having a television dropped on his head. This is a meta moment of the first order. Williamson is acknowledging through the character of Scott that the fan theory about Stu's survival is part of the Scream franchise's cultural legacy, that it has existed in the discourse for 3 decades and is now being brought into the text of the film itself. Scott and Madison are killed by Ghostface. The house is then doused in gasoline and set on fire. The opening image of the franchise's most iconic location burning is, as I mentioned earlier, a symbol. It is Williamson saying that this film is not interested in simple nostalgia, that it is willing to destroy the physical side of the mythology's origin in order to tell the story it wants to tell. Madison survives the initial attack with severe burns, which becomes relevant later in the film. We move to Pine Grove, Indiana. Sidney Prescott has become Sydney Evans. She is married to Mark Evans, played by Joel McHale, with a quiet warmth that makes Mark one of the more likable new additions to the franchise's supporting roster, even if the screenplay does not develop him much beyond his function as the person who loves Sydney and therefore needs to be put in danger. Sydney runs a coffee shop called Little Latte. She has several children, and among them is Tatum Evans, her teenage daughter, named after Tatum Riley, her best friend who was killed by Ghostface in the original film. This naming is one of the film's most quietly devastating details. Sydney has been carrying the memory of her dead best friend in the name of her living daughter for Tatum's entire life. Every time she calls her daughter's name, she is also saying goodbye to someone she never stopped mourning. That is the kind of emotional depth that good character writing produces, and it is one of the things that makes Sidney's story in Screen 7 genuinely moving even when the surrounding narrative falters. The first act of the film introduces Tatum's social world. She has a group of friends that includes Hannah Thorman, played by McKenna Grace, and Chloe Parker, played by Celeste O'Connor. She has a boyfriend named Ben, played by Sam Ragnar. These are the characters who will become the film's body count, and as I noted in the earlier section, the screenplay does not give them sufficient development to make their deaths feel like genuine loss rather than structural necessity. Hannah and Chloe in particular feel like the film was aware that casting Grace and O'Connor required more than what was written for them, but the production timeline and the screenplay's priorities did not allow for their characters to be more fully drawn. The Ghostface calls begin. Sidney receives the video call at Little Latte, and when she accepts, she sees Schumacher on the screen, aged, scarred, but recognizably Stu. This moment is staged with considerable skill. Williamson holds the video call on a phone screen rather than in full frame, which creates a specific kind of uncanny dread. The image is slightly compressed, slightly degraded by the mechanics of a video call, which makes the face both present and mediated, both intimate and distant. And Matthew Lillard's performance in this video footage is genuinely unsettling. He plays an older Stu with the kind of damaged intelligence that makes the possibility of survival feel plausible rather than absurd. The scars on his face are specific and detailed, as though someone spent considerable time imagining what 30 years of hiding and healing would have done to a person who survived catastrophic head trauma. This is the film's most effective early manipulation of your expectations, and it works precisely because Lillard commits to it fully. Sidney's reaction is, as I have described, one of Campbell's finest moments in the franchise. She does not scream. She does not collapse. She controls her face and her voice with the precision of someone who has survived enough to know that showing fear is a tactical disadvantage. But her hand on the counter of her coffee shop is white-knuckled, and that physical detail, small and specific and entirely true, tells you everything that her controlled expression is working to conceal. Gail Weathers arrives in Pine Grove when the murders begin. Gail is now running a smaller scale news operation, accompanied by Mindy Meeks Martin and Chad Meeks Martin as her interns, which is a plot logic that requires a certain generosity of imagination to accept, given that Mindy and Chad were the film's primary survivor characters from the previous two entries and now function essentially as comic relief. Gail reviews the information about Stu's death records, which is the film's way of opening the question of his survival within the investigative framework. She and Sidney begin working together in the way they always have, with a mixture of genuine affection and barely contained competition, and their scenes together are, as I have said, the best writing in the film. The first Ghostface killing in Pine Grove is staged with real craft. The victim is a neighbor's son named Lucas, and the sequence has a technical precision that uses the architecture of a school theater to create genuine spatial dread. This is the sequence scored with the silence I described earlier, where Beltrami's absence of music makes every sound abnormally present. The kill itself is brutal in the way scream kills have always been brutal, not gratuitous spectacle but purposeful violence that reminds you what is at stake. Williamson directed with more confidence than his other action sequences in the film, suggesting that the school theater provided a spatial canvas that suited his visual instincts better than more open environments. Then comes the first major reveal, and it happens only about 30 minutes into the film, which is an unusually early first unmasking for the franchise. One of the ghost faces attacks Sidney and her family at their home. It is a visceral, well-staged sequence in which Sidney is stabbed with a fire poker and Mark is severely wounded. As the killer flees the house, Gail, arriving at exactly the right moment in a move that is pure Gail Weathers, runs over the fleeing ghost face with her cart. The figure is unmasked, and the revelation is genuinely strange. This is Carl Gibbs, an escape patient from Fallbrook, the local psychiatric facility. Carl has no connection to Sidney beyond the fact that he came through her coffee shop earlier in the film. He has no mythology, No franchise history, no motive that the characters can identify. He is, at least at this stage of the film, apparently random. This is the film's most interesting structural choice and also its most divisive one. By presenting a first Ghostface who appears to be entirely disconnected from the narrative's emotional logic, Scream 7 is doing something that subverts the franchise's own conventions in a deliberately destabilizing way. Every previous Scream film has followed the pattern of a killer whose motive is deeply personal, whose connection to Sidney or to the events of the original film is the emotional engine of the mystery. Carr Gibbs has no such connection, at least on the surface, and the film uses that absence of motive to heighten Sidney's paranoia. She knows because she has lived this story enough times to know that there is always more than one ghost face. There is always a larger plan. The random seeming attack is not random. It is the opening move of something more orchestrated. But the film takes this in a direction that, upon reflection, feels underdeveloped. Carr is eventually revealed to have been directed to the house by Marco, who used his position at Fallbrook to manipulate a vulnerable patient into carrying out the first attack. The mechanism makes narrative sense, but it means that Carl is essentially a weapon rather than a character, and the horror of a ghost face who seems to have no motive, which could have been genuinely disturbing, is diffused by the eventual explanation rather than deepened by it. The middle section of the film deals primarily with Sidney and Gil's investigation into the stew question. Tatum and her friends are being stalked in a parallel storyline that is less well executed than the Sidney material, primarily because the young characters feel less specific and less invested. Tatum's boyfriend Ben discovers deepfake software on his laptop, which is used as a red herring suggesting that he might be involved in the Ghostface operation. This red herring is the film's clumsiest narrative construction because the explanation for why Ben had the software essentially that he was an idiot who was independently investigating the store rumors and creating test deepfakes as proof of concept without telling anyone requires a leap of credulity that the film handles awkwardly. Ben dies before he can explain himself and the film moves on without fully resolving why the software was there in a way that feels satisfying. The deepfake technology is revealed fully in one of the film's most technically impressive and conceptually interesting sequences. Sydney returns home to find a message waiting on her television, and as she watches, the face on screen cycles through digital transformations. Stumacher becomes Nancy Loomis, Nancy Loomis becomes Roman Ridger, Roman Ridger becomes Dewey Riley. Lauren Metcalf, Scott Foley, and David Arquette appear in these digital resurrections, their faces and voices rendered with a precision that is intentionally unsettling. And the sequence achieves something important. It makes you feel the specific horror of having your dead weaponized against you. Dewey in particular is devastating. David Arquette's Dewey was killed in Scream 2022. After surviving impossible injuries across 5 fins and seeing his face appear on the screen as a digital tool of torment is genuinely affecting. Sydney's response to the Dewey deepfake is the sequence that pushes her over the edge, which makes emotional sense. Dewey was the gentlest presence in her life, the person who was always there, not as a warrior but as a friend, and seeing that gentle face distorted into a weapon is the specific cruelty that breaks through her defenses. There was also an originally filmed sequence involving a Skid Ulrich deepfake, bringing back the face of Billy Loomis, Sydney's original tormentor and the killer whose actions set the entire franchise in motion. Ulrich was announced as returning for the film during early casting reports. But the Billy deepfake does not appear in the released version of the film, presumably cut for pacing or tonal reasons. The absence is felt. Billy Loomis is the origin point of everything Sydney has survived. His deepfake would have been the most emotionally complete version of the sequence's argument. Its absence feels like a significant missed opportunity, though one can understand the creative reasoning that led to its removal. Now we reach the climax, and this is where Scream 7 both delivers and disappoints simultaneously in ways that are worth examining with genuine honesty. Tatum is kidnapped and taken home. with a note left for Sidney saying she has been taken where the heart is. This is an echo of the franchise's recurring motif of the home as both sanctuary and trap, and it connects specifically to the image of Steve tied up at the beginning of the original screen. Drew Barrymore's boyfriend used as leverage over a woman who could not save him. The callback is intentional and clearly staged as such. Sydney arrives at her house to find her daughter in the backyard, tied to a chair, exactly replicating that 30-year-old image. The full circle quality of this moment is earned through the franchise's history, even when the specific scene staging is somewhat stiff. The first unmasking at the climax reveals Marco. Attenborough plays Marco with a specific kind of disturbed intensity that is more effective than his earlier appearances in the film suggested it would be. Marco's reveal as one of the ghost faces is not a shock in the way the best Scream reveals are shocks, because the film has not given him enough screen time or emotional weight to make his unmasking feel like a betrayal of trust. You probably suspected him. The film probably wanted you to suspect him, but not with complete confidence. The problem is that the clues pointing toward Marco are thinner than the franchise's best mysteries, and the revelation has the quality of a correct guess confirmed rather than a genuine revelation, reshaping your understanding of everything that came before. The second unmasking is the film's central narrative gamble, and it is both the most conceptually interesting thing Scream 7 does and its most significant execution failure. As Marco is revealed and the situation seems to be stabilizing, a third figure appears and removes the ghost face mask. It is Jessica Borden. Anna Camp's Jessica, who has appeared in perhaps 3 scenes before this moment, is now standing in Sydney's backyard, explaining that she was inspired by Sydney's book to kill her own abusive husband, that this act of violence felt like liberation, and that she wanted to recreate the conditions that produced Sidney Prescott so that she could produce herself. She checked herself into full brook where she met Marco. She developed this 2D fake plan using Marco's IT background to create the digital resurrections. She orchestrated the entire campaign. And her goal, stated in the villain monologue that the franchise has always used as a moment of both revelation and self-parody, is to take Sydney's daughter and raise Tatum as her own, having killed Sydney in the process, recreating for herself the mythology of survival and loss that she believed gave Sydney her power. The conceptual architecture of Jessica's motivation is genuinely interesting. The idea of a ghost face whose motive is not revenge of fame or franchise adjacent obsession, but rather a desire to replicate the conditions of Sydney's victimhood in order to claim the strength she believes those conditions produced, is the franchise's darkest and most complex take on fandom and parasocial obsession. There is something genuinely disturbing about a person who not only idolizes a survivor, but wishes to be the architect of a new version of that survivor's origin story, who believes that suffering is transferable through recreation, that is psychologically specific and culturally resonant in ways that connect to real contemporary discourse about parasocial regime, about the way public figures who share stories of trauma become responsible for the needs of the people who receive those stories. But Anna Camp is given approximately 8 minutes of screen time in the film before the reveal, and no amount of conceptual interest in a villain's motivation can compensate for the absence of the narrative groundwork that would make that reveal feel earned rather than convenient. When Jessica unmasks, you should feel the kind of cold water shock that the franchise has always provided at its best, the sudden recontextualization of every scene you have watched that now reads differently in light of the revelation. With Jessica, you instead feel the intellectual interest of a good idea delivered too quickly. She was in 2 throwaway scenes that now read as intentional minimalism rather than the sophisticated misdirection that the franchise's best reveals achieve. The film needed either significantly more of Jessica's presence in the first 2 acts, enough to make you consider and dismiss her as a suspect based on apparently exonerating information, or it needed to give Cam the screen time to establish a specific offness in her apparently normal behavior that in retrospect would reveal itself as carefully maintained performance. Neither approach was taken, and the reveal lands with a thud where it should land with an earthquake. The climax itself, the physical confrontation in the unfinished garage, has been criticized in several reviews for the amount of screen time devoted to its setting. The incompleteness of the space, exposed beams, bare concrete, half installed fixtures is certainly symbolic in the way I described earlier. The idea of Sydney's life as a project, always in process, never fully resolved. But the action staging in the garage is the film's least inspired extended sequence, lacking the spatial creativity that Scream's best fight sequences achieve. The kin of Marco dispatched cleanly with a bullet to the head is efficient but not memorable. The death of Jessica is more elaborate, shot repeatedly in the head by both Sidney and Tatum in an act of deliberate overkill that references the ongoing franchise joke about ensuring that Ghostface is actually dead this time, and which serves as a moment of shared violence between mother and daughter that is meant to be cathartic and connecting rather than simply brutal. Matt's survival is one of the film's more absurd moments. He was stabbed in the chest severely early in the film and spends the movie presumably dying, only to be discovered still alive in the carriage, which requires a certain generosity toward the film's internal logic that even franchise fans found difficult to extend. His survival is clearly a narrative necessity because killing Sidney's husband would push the emotional weight of the film's ending in a direction that Williamson was not interested in exploring at this stage. But the mechanics of his survival strained credibility in a way that a stronger screenplay would have addressed. The film ends with Sidney and Tatum alive, Mark wounded but surviving, Gail in possession of an extraordinary news story, and the Meeks twins presumably updating their horror film analysis frameworks to include deepfake ghost faces and obsessed book fans. There is no post-credits scene. Instead, there is a mid-credits sequence featuring Chad and Mindy that is played primarily for comedy and that positions them as continuing to orbit the franchise's events in a supporting capacity. It is the kind of closing beat that satisfies franchise fans who want to know what happened to these characters without doing the heavy lifting of fully integrating them into the main narrative. One of the most interesting production notes about the ending is the revelation that the film originally contained an alternate ending tested with audiences in which Schumacher was revealed to genuinely be alive. The deepfake was not the full story. The deepfake was a cover, and somewhere out there, aged and scarred and still breathing, the real Schumacher was watching. That alternate ending was cut. The reasons are not fully public, but the creative decision to use the deepfake as the definitive explanation rather than as a misdirection covering a genuine survival is one that I find interesting to think about. The alternate ending would have been the bolder choice. It would have committed to the fan theory in a way that would have made the film's central gamble pay off completely. The decision to pull back from that commitment to use the deepfake as the final answer rather than as a layer beneath a deeper truth is the decision that leaves Scream 7 feeling slightly smaller than it set out to be. Not because it plays things safe exactly, but because it takes a risk and then partially hedges it at the last moment. The foreshadowing elements that reveal themselves most clearly on a rewatch are primarily connected to Jessica's presence in the early scenes. There are moments where her comments to Sidney, brief and apparently neighborly, carry a subtext that is visible once you know what she is. Her interest in Sidney's children, particularly Tatum, is consistent and specifically focused in a way that reads differently after the reveal. Her question about whether Sidney ever regretted writing her book, asked conversationally and apparently sympathetically, is now legible as the question of someone who is planning to use that book as both inspiration and motivation for murder. These details are there, but they are too sparse and too slight to create the experience of genuine recontextualization that the best Scream reviews produce. On a rewatch, you find the clues. On a first viewing, you likely did not notice them because there was not enough of Jessica for them to register. The handling of the legacy character appearances deserves its final assessment here. Rory Metcalf's Nancy Loomis deepfake is brief and somewhat underserved. Scott Foley's Roman Bridger deepfake appears for only a few seconds. David Arquette's Dewey deepfake is the most emotionally resonant, as I have described. The decision not to include Skate Ulrich as Billy Loomis, even in deepfake form, remains the most significant absence in the film. Billy Loomis is the origin of everything. His face would have been the most powerful element of the deepfake sequence. His absence is reportedly due to scheduling or creative differences, but the gap he leaves is palpable. Matthew Lillard's Stu ultimately being entirely a deepfake is the film's most thematically interesting resolution to its central mystery, even if it is also its most deflating narrative one. The 3 decades of fan theory have not been validated. Stu is dead. The possibility of his survival, which the film spends so much of its first and second acts carefully nurturing, is finally foreclosed. What remains is the image of Stu that the film created, not the real Stu, but a constructed version of him designed to weaponize Sydney's memories. And there is something genuinely resonant about that conclusion, something that speaks to the way the past operates in trauma. The Stu that haunts Sydney is not and was never quite the real Stu. It was always a constructed image, built from fear and memory and the narrative logic of horror. The deepfake is not just a plot device, it is a metaphor for how trauma works. And that, I think, is the best thing Scream 7 does in its spoilerable territory. There's a particular kind of silence that arrives after a horror film ends. Not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of nothing left to say, but the silence of too much having been said at once, the silence of a mind still sorting through what it received and deciding what to keep. I sat in that silence for a long time after Scream 7 ended. Not because the film overwhelmed me with greatness, I want to be honest with you about that, but because it touched something real inside a framework that did not always deserve the realness it was reaching for. And that combination, genuine emotion inside imperfect architecture, is the most human kind of artistic experience there is. It is the experience of watching someone try sincerely, of recognizing the effort behind every choice, even the choices that did not fully work. And that sincerity stayed with me longer than a more polished but more hollow film would have. Let me step entirely away from analysis now. Let me set down the critical framework and the thematic vocabulary and a careful language of assessment and just speak to you as a person who felt this film and is now trying to account for what it left behind. The single moment that has not left me is not a kill sequence. It is not the reveal of the killer or the climactic fight in the unfinished garage or the deep fake sequence which Dewey's face appearing on the television screen. The moment that has genuinely not left me is one of the quietest in the entire film, a scene so brief and so undramatic that you might have looked down at your popcorn and missed it. It happens in the coffee shop. Early in the film, before the Ghostface calls begin, before the murders start, before the world Sydney so carefully constructed starts coming apart at the seams again, Sydney's behind the counter. The morning light comes through the window at a low angle. The kind of autumn light that makes everything look slightly golden and slightly fragile at the same time. She hands someone a coffee. She smiles. It is a real smile, not a polite customer service smile, but an actual lived-in, honest smile, the smile of a woman who is genuinely content in the moment she is inhabiting. And then the shot holds on her face for just a second longer than you expect, and in that extra second you see something else beneath the contentment, a watchfulness, a specific kind of attentiveness to her surroundings that has nothing to do with customer service and everything to do with 30 years of living in a body that learned to stay ready. She is happy. She is also always listening. Both of those things are true at the same time, and Neve Campbell conveys both simultaneously without making the second one cancel out the first. I have been trying to name the emotion that scene produced in me ever since I left the theater. The closest I can get is this. It is the feeling of recognizing someone's survival in their ordinary behavior. The way a person who has been through something enormous carries it in the small habits, the slight over-awareness, the barely perceptible tension they cannot quite fully release even in moments of genuine peace. Sidney Prescott has never been fully at rest in the 30 years of this franchise. Not once, not even in the scenes that were meant to show her moving on, or rebuilding, or achieving some version of normalcy. There has always been the listening beneath the living, and to see that rendered with such precision in a single held shot in a coffee shop felt like the most truthful thing this franchise has ever said about what survival actually looks and feels like from the inside. That image has not left me because it is not just about Sydney. It is about everyone who has ever had to build a life in the aftermath of something that tried to unmake them. Everyone who has ever learned to smile with their eyes while the rest of their awareness scans the room. That kind of recognition when fiction reaches across the space between the screen and the seat and touches something you actually know is the reason cinema matters. And Screen 7 gave me that. One perfect, quiet, heartbreaking, hopeful image of a woman having a Tuesday morning, while also never quite being able to stop listening for the sound of a knife. I want to stay with this question of what this film left behind in me for a while longer, because I think it is worth more than a single observation. Scream 7 did something to my understanding of the franchise that I am still processing, and I want to try to articulate it as clearly as I can, because I think it might resonate with those of you who have grown up watching these films the way I have. For most of my engagement with the Scream franchise, I understood Sidney Prescott as the frame around which the genre machinery operated. She was the final girl, the survivor, the emotional center through which all the horror was filtered and given meaning. She was the reason the kills mattered, the reason the reveals landed with weight rather than merely with shock, the reason the franchise had earned its longevity. But she was, in my understanding, primarily a function of the genre. The genre needed a final girl. Sydney was the best one ever written. That was my relationship to her. Scream 7 changed that understanding in a way I did not expect and am genuinely grateful for. What this film had missy, partly through the quality of its best scenes and partly through the clarity that comes from the contrast with its weaker sections, is that Sidney Prescott is not a function of the Scream franchise. The Scream franchise is a function of Sidney Prescott. She is not there to give the horror meaning. The horror is there to review what she is made of, and what she is made of, as Neve Campbell has been showing us across 7 films with a consistency and a depth that is extraordinary in the context of a commercial horror franchise, is not in vulnerability or toughness or genre competence, though she has all of those things. What she is made of is the specific human quality of refusing to be defined by what happened to her, even as she is unavoidably shaped by it. That is not a genre quality, that is a human quality, and understanding it as such changes the entire flame through which I now watch the franchise. Did this film change how I see something beyond the franchise? Yes, I think it did. It changed how I think about the relationship between public narratives of survival and the private people who live inside those narratives. Sydney's book Out of Darkness is treated in this film as both her greatest achievement and her most dangerous act. By putting her story into the world, she helped people. We know this. Jessica Bowden survived an abusive marriage because of Sydney's words. That is real and meaningful and genuinely good, but the act of making her story public also made Sydney into a symbol, and symbols do not get to rest, do not get to retreat, do not get to change or evolve or decide that they are done. Symbols belong to the people who need them. And once Sydney attempted to reclaim her own story, to retire from the role of living symbol and become a private person again, some of the people who had made her a symbol felt abandoned. The specific pathology of Jessica is extreme, but the underlying dynamic she represents is not. We live in an age of memoirs and survivor platforms and public testimonies of personal catastrophe, and the people who share those stories receive enormous gratitude and also enormous expectation. They are celebrated for their openness and then held accountable to a version of themselves that openness created. Scream 7 understands this. It does not resolve it, but it understands it. And understanding something complex without pretending to resolve, it is one of the things that good storytelling does. Would I return to this film? I would. With specific intentions rather than with general enthusiasm, but with genuine anticipation for the parts of it that earned my engagement. I would return to the Signe and Gale conversation in the diner because it is the best writing in the film and because Cox and Campbell together create a specific chemical reaction that has been present across 7 films and has never quite lost its energy. I would return to the fake sequence, not because it is perfectly executed, but because the idea beneath it, the weaponization of the dead against the living, the way grief can be reverse engineered into trauma, is genuinely haunting and worth sitting with more than once. I would return to the score, specifically to the Mrs. Evans' Lament, composition by Marco Beltrami, which plays during a scene near the film's midpoint and which transforms the original, Sidney's Lament motif into something older and more worn and more honest than the original, a musical statement about what 3 decades of carrying a melody does to its sound. And I would return always to that coffee shop shot, to that Tuesday morning, to those 2 seconds of someone having a life while also never quite fully being at rest inside it. What kind of person will carry this film with them? Let me be specific rather than general, because that specificity is more useful to you than a vague category. The person who will carry Scream 7 is someone who remembers where they were when they first saw the original Scream. Whether they were 8 years old watching it somewhere they probably should not have been, or 15 and at a sleepover and genuinely terrified, or 20 and already a horror film devotee who recognized immediately that something different was happening on screen, the specific memory of encountering Sidney Prescott for the first time is the foundation from which this film's emotional power grows. If you have that memory, if you have been watching this human survive for years or decades, this film will give you something real. The specific emotion of a reunion, the particular pleasure of recognition, the feeling of returning to someone you know well and finding that they have aged in ways you understand and respect. The person who will carry this film is also, and this is less obvious, someone who has ever tried to put something down that would not stay put. Anyone who has had a chapter of their life that they declared closed and then found reopening. Anyone who has renamed themselves, relocated themselves, remade themselves only to discover that the thing they were remaking themselves away from had a longer reach than the distance they had traveled. Sydney's experience in Pine Grove is, at its core, the experience of someone who discovered that changing your name and your address does not change your history, and that the past is not a place you leave but a thing you carry, and that the best you can do is learn to carry it without letting it carry you. That is a universal human experience dressed in a ghost face mask, and the people who feel that universality will carry this film with them in a way that goes beyond franchise loyalty. Now let me speak to you directly, clearly, and with the honesty that I believe you deserve when you spend your time in this space. The complete experience of Scream 7 is this. It is a film of genuine parts inside an imperfect whole, and the genuine parts are genuine enough that the whole is worth the time it asks of you. Let me be specific about what the genuine parts are, because they deserve to be named clearly, rather than indicated vaguely. Neve Campbell's performance is not just the best thing in this film. It is one of the best performances in the Scream franchise's 30-year history, which is a statement I have considered carefully before making. What Campbell does in Scream 7 is something that requires all 7 films to fully understand, because she is playing not just Sidney in this specific moment, but Sidney as a continuous person across a lifetime of extraordinary experience. She's playing a woman who is simultaneously the 18-year-old girl who survived the worst night of her life in Woodsboro, the young woman who kept surviving in sequels and in cities and in the face of increasingly impossible odds, the adult who wrote a book about her trauma and tried to turn it into something useful for others, and now the middle-aged mother who changed her name and moved to Indiana and thought, perhaps naively, that she had finally earned the right to rest. All of those Sydneys exist in every frame Campbell is in. You see them all simultaneously. That is the work of an extraordinary performer who has been thinking about this character for 3 decades and who understands her with the intimacy of a biographer rather than the competence of an actor playing a role. Marco Beltrami's score is, as I have said, a genuine achievement that deserves more attention than the mixed reviewed franchise entry will receive for its musical construction. His ability to take the original themes of the franchise and age them, to let them carry the weight of the years they have accumulated, to introduce new variations that speak to the specific emotional content of this film's story, is the work of a composer who takes his collaborations seriously, even when the surrounding project is not operating at its highest level. There is a piece he wrote for this film called What's in a Name that plays during the deepfake reveal sequence, and it is a 3-minute argument in musical form about the relationship between an identity and its construction, about whether a name is real or chosen or imposed, about whether the version of yourself that others know is the same as the version of yourself that you know. It is a beautiful, melancholy, and genuinely moving piece of music, and it elevates the sequence it scores beyond what the visual direction alone achieves. The emotional core of the Sidney and Gail relationship, which Williamson writes with 30 years of earned intimacy, is the screenplay's most consistent success and the film's most durable human achievement. Their scenes together have a specific texture, a warmth and a friction existing in the same space that reflects a relationship that is too old and too complicated to be simply friendly or simply adversarial. There are women who have been through the unsurvivable together and who have come out with something that is not quite friendship and not quite sisterhood, but is deeper than either word manages to capture. When Gaylord arrives in Pine Grove and the camera shows us their first look at each other, something happens between Cox and Campbell that is entirely unscripted in any meaningful sense, because scripts do not generate that kind of recognition. That look and everything it contains is the result of 30 years of these two women being in scenes together, and it is available nowhere else in cinema, because nowhere else in cinema has this specific relationship been developing for this long. Let me also speak carefully and honestly about the film's relationship to the controversy that surrounded its creation, because this is part of the complete experience of Scream 7, and it would be dishonest to leave it unacknowledged in this final section. Melissa Barrera's firing from this franchise is a wound in its history that this film carries, whether it acknowledges it directly or not. Barrera was building something as Sam Carpenter, a character whose psychological complexity, the daughter of a serial killer learning to reckon with what that inheritance meant for her own identity, was the most interesting new character direction this franchise had taken in a decade. Her departure did not just remove an actress, it removed a narrative architecture. It removed the story that Scream 7 was supposed to tell, and what replaced it, while containing genuine achievements, cannot fully pretend to be the film it would have been without that loss. Jenna Ortega's departure compounded this, and the absence of Tara and Sam Carpenter is a presence in the film for anyone who felt invested in where their story was going. The film's way of handling their absence is efficient but not deeply felt, acknowledging it through Gear's brief references to the events of Scream 6 without dwelling on the characters or their significance. That efficiency is understandable and probably the right choice given the film's need to move forward rather than mourn, but it is a loss, and naming it is part of an honest accounting of what Scream 7 is. Who will love this film most deeply? I want to be specific here rather than vague, because you deserve useful guidance rather than safe generality. You will love this film if Sidney Prescott means something to you that goes beyond genre appreciation. If she is a character you have returned to across years and life changes and your own various survivals, if you found in her refusal to be destroyed a reflection of some refusal in yourself, then this film will give you something that functions almost like a gift. The gift of seeing that character honored by the person who created her, back in the role that should always have been hers, playing her with the completeness and the depth that the franchise had not fully achieved since Scream 4. That is a rare gift and a rare experience, and it is worth the price of admission and the frustration of the narrative elements that do not fully serve it. You will love this film if you have a particular appreciation for what horror can do when it takes its emotional content seriously. Not all horror is interested in being emotionally true. Most of it is interested in being effectively frightening, which is a valid ambition but a different one. The Scream franchise at its best has always wanted both, and Scream 7 in its best passages wants both with the sincerity that is palpable. The horror here is not just designed to make you flinch. It is designed to make you feel the specific terror of a particular kind of loss, the loss of the ordinary, the loss of the Tuesday morning, the loss of the life you built after the previous life was taken from you. The thematic dimension of the horror is what separates this franchise from its peers, and Scream 7 maintains it imperfectly but genuinely. You will love this film if you are interested in the making of films as much as in the films themselves. Because the story of how Scream 7 came to exist, the chaos and the loss and the creative decisions made under extraordinary pressure, is woven into the texture of the finished product in ways that make watching it a more layered experience than a film made under clean conditions would provide. You are watching a film that survived its own making. There is something in that survival that mirrors its subject matter in a way that is probably unintentional but is entirely real. Who may not connect with this film and why? Let me be equally specific here. If you are coming to Scream 7 without significant investment in the franchise's history, without the accumulated emotional context of the previous 6 films, the experience will be significantly flattened. The things that make these films genuine achievements feel like achievements. Campbell's return, the specific weight of the Sidney and Gale dynamic, the emotional resonance of Tatum's name, and what it means for Sidney to have given it to her daughter. These are all things that require the franchise's history to land with their full force. Without that history, Scream 7 is a competent slasher with an uneven screenplay and a strong lead performance. That is not nothing, but it is considerably less than what the film offers someone who has been watching since 1996. If you are someone who came to love the Scream franchise through its most recent 2 entries, through the radio silence films and the specific energy that Barrera and Ortega brought to their characters, this film will require a period of mourning before it can offer you anything else. The creative direction of those films was building towards something that Scream 7 essentially dismantles and replaces. However well intentioned, is a loss for the narrative momentum that Scream 2022 and Scream Z had established. You may find your way to appreciating what this film offers on its own terms, and I hope you do, but it is honest to acknowledge that the path there may require you to grieve what it is not, before you can appreciate what it is. If you are primarily interested in horror as a formal achievement, in films that push the visual and acoustic language of fear into genuinely new territory, this film will disappoint you. Williamson's direction, as I have noted, is more straightforward and formally ambitious, and the cinematography lacks the visual intensity that the franchise's best work has achieved. This is not a film that reimagines what a Scream film can look like. It is a film that remembers what a Scream film feels like and delivers that feeling with more consistency than formal innovation. For some viewers, that warmth of feeling is exactly what they needed. For others, it will not be enough. Cinema, streaming, or something to own? Let me think about this carefully, because the answer genuinely differs based on who you are. In the cinema, Scream 7 offers you the specific pleasure of a shared experience with an audience that loves what you love. The opening sequences, particularly the Woodsboro prologue, benefit from skill. The kill sequences, particularly the school theater sequence, have a spatial architecture that a theater screen honors more fully than a television or a laptop. The score, Beltrami's richly orchestrated and emotionally layered work, sounds best in an environment designed for acoustic precision. If you are a franchise devotee who can still access the film in a theater, the theatrical experience has something to offer you that streaming cannot replicate. On streaming, which is where most of you will encounter this film, the experience is complete and the genuine achievements remain intact. The performances are scale independent in the best sense, which is to say that Campbell and Cox and May do their finest work in close up in the quiet spaces between the horror beats, and those performances are fully available on a screen of any size. The deepfake sequence, which is partly about the uncanny quality of a face that is almost right, actually benefits from the slightly reduced distance of a home viewing, where the screen is closer and the face more intimate and the wrongness of the digital construction more viscerally felt. Own it? I would own it if Sidney Prescott means something to me in the way I described, if I am the kind of person who wants to return to specific scenes with intention and without the social commitment of a rewatch. The digital release, now available with over 40 minutes of bonus content, including deleted scenes and behind the scenes material, is worth the investment if you are interested in understanding how this film was made, because the making of it is genuinely fascinating, and the deleted scenes apparently include the alternate ending in which Stu was actually alive, which I would very much like to see simply as an artifact of what this film might have been. My rating for Scream 7 is 6 out of 10. I want to explain exactly what that number means, because a rating without explanation is just noise, and you deserve more than noise when you have given this conversation your time. 6 out of 10 does not mean average in the dismissive sense of that word. It means the film contains genuine, real, and enduring achievements alongside genuine, real, and significant failures, and that these two things exist in close enough proximity that neither cancels the other out. It means that Neve Campbell's performance alone is worth more than the score my overall assessment gives the film, but that a score reflecting only the best element of a film is not an honest score. It means that the genuine moments of this film, the Tuesday morning, the deepfakes Dewey, the Sidney and Gare conversation, the Mrs. Evans lament, the coffee shop smile, are as real and as earned as anything in the franchise's history, and that the hollow characters, the rushed villain motivation, the cinematographic flatness, and the pacing failures of the second act are equally real and equally honest to acknowledge. It means that I walked out of the theater moved and frustrated in proportions that felt roughly equal, and that the movement I felt has stayed with me longer than I expected, which tells me the film is worth more than its failures, even when those failures are significant. The one true sentence that earns this rating is the one that I keep returning to every time I consider it. This film loves Sidney Prescott so completely and serves its own story so imperfectly that you finish it feeling both grateful and hungry. Grateful what was given and hungry for what was withheld. And that particular combination of emotions is, I suspect, exactly what 30 years of following a franchise feels like. There is a specific feeling that arrives when a great film ends well. Not a feeling of resolution, because the best endings are not about resolving but about arriving somewhere true. It is the feeling of being left in exactly the right place, a place that is not an endpoint but a landing, a place where the film deposits you that is different from where you were when it began. The final image of Scream 7, Sydney and Tatum in the early light of morning outside the house that was nearly their ending, carries that quality even inside all the film's imperfections. It is a quiet image. It does not explain itself. It does not reach for significance. It simply shows you two people who made it through the night, mother and daughter, named for the same grief, standing in the new morning of something that might, this time, be a beginning rather than merely a continuation of survival. The morning light in that final shot is the same kind of light as the morning light in the coffee shop at the beginning of the film, and that is not an accident. Williamson is closing a circle. The same pale, golden, slightly fragile autumn light that illuminated Sydney's ordinary Tuesday at the beginning is the light that finds her at the end, after everything has been destroyed and survived again. The light has not changed. That is the point. The world does not reward survival with a different light. The ordinary morning looks exactly the same whether you are living quietly within it or whether you have just fought your way back to it. What changes is the knowledge of what it costs to be standing in it. The light is the same, but you are not. And that quiet difference felt but not spoken, visible in a posture rather than a line of dialogue, in the specific way two people stand near each other in a morning they nearly did not reach, is the truest thing Scream 7 offers. Not the kills, not the masks, not the reveals. The standing, the breathing, the light finding you again after the dark. That image is where I live now after this film, and it is finally enough. Before we close, I want to take a genuine moment to thank you for being here. Not in the perfunctory way that a host thanks their audience, but with the specific gratitude of someone who understands what it means that you chose to spend time in this conversation rather than in any of the thousand other conversations available to you. You are here because you feel something about cinema, because you believe it is worth understanding rather than merely experiencing, because you want to leave a film with more than a memory of its surface. That impulse, that reaching for the deeper layer, is the reason this channel exists, and your presence in it is what gives it meaning. I would genuinely love to hear from you in the comments below about several things that I have been sitting with and that I think are worth a real conversation. First and most immediately, was Neve Campbell's return worth the creative reshaping that bringing her back required? Does the film's emotional success around Sydney justify the loss of the Barrera and Ortega storyline, or do you feel that what was sacrificed was ultimately worth more than what was gained? Second, and more broadly, the deep fake conceit in this film. The idea of using artificial resurrections of the dead to psychologically torment the living felt to me like the most genuinely contemporary horror idea the franchise has introduced in years. Did it resonate with you in the same way? Or did the execution frustrate you enough that the concept's potential was lost? And third, the question I keep returning to personally, Scream 7 is a film about what survivors owe to the people who found hope in their survival. Do think Sydney made the right choice by retreating to Pine Grove and changing her name? Or do you think she owed her audience something more? I do not have a clean answer to that question. I think it is genuinely complicated, genuinely worth arguing about, and I would love to know where you land on it. For those of you who want to continue this conversation beyond the comments, I am always available in the community posts, and we have been having some genuinely extraordinary discussions there about the films we have been covering this season. The depth of thinking that this community brings to cinema is something I am consistently moved by, and I want you to know that. Now, the next film we are sitting with on the Cine Flux is one I have been wanting to make for a long time. It is a film that arrived without ceremony and found its audience slowly, the way the best films sometimes do, in the quiet spaces between the loud releases, pass from one person to another to the kind of recommendation that carries genuine urgency rather than mere enthusiasm. It is a film about grief and about time and about the specific way certain losses refuse to stay in the past, and it is, I believe, one of the most emotionally honest pieces of cinema to emerge in recent years. I cannot say much more than that without entering spoiler territory before we have even begun, but I will say this: it is the kind of film that the Cineflux exists to explore, the kind of film that needs to be felt before it can be understood, and that becomes more true the more times you return to it. You will not want to miss it. I will leave the details for when we are there together. Until then, keep watching with your whole self. Keep letting the light from the screen find you in the dark. Keep asking what the film is really saying, not just what it is showing. Keep feeling cinema rather than simply consuming it. That is what we are here for. That is what we will always be here for. That is the Cineflux. I will see you in the next one.